All right, let's dive into the world of Donald J. Trump. You guys gave us a lot to work with on this one. Video clips, articles, even parts of Trump's art of the deal. Should be interesting to see how it all comes together.
Definitely, yeah. With this mix, I think we can really get a sense of how he's built his image over time, over the decades, and maybe even see some patterns in how he does things, whether it's real estate, reality TV, or even the White House.
Okay, let's unpack it all. Starting with, what was his childhood? It's pretty well known that Trump grew up wealthy, but born in Queens and then living in a 23-room mansion, 9 bathrooms. That's not exactly typical.
No, not at all. But, you know, the sources suggest that even with all that privilege, young Donald was really pushed by his dad, Fred. Fred was a successful real estate developer himself, but from what I've read, he was a pretty tough and demanding guy. Apparently, he'd crammed 9 days of work into a 7-day work week, and it seems like he instilled that same relentless drive in Donald.
It wasn't just about working hard, though, was it? There's that story about the music teacher ending up with a black eye, courtesy of, well, young Donald Trump.
Yeah, I read that too. Even then, you see some early signs of the Trump we know today that need to be noticed to be on top, even if it means, maybe bending the rules a bit or pushing boundaries.
His dad sent him off to New York Military Academy when he was 13, thinking that would straighten him out. You'd think that might backfire, but he actually did really well there.
It makes you wonder, right? I mean, the strict structure, the clear pecking order, it's almost like a blueprint for how he'd approach business and politics later on.
He was captain his senior year, a top athlete, even got the nickname Ladies' Man in the yearbook. Sounds like he was determined to, well, to make his mark.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
And he apparently told classmates that I'm going to be famous someday. And that ambition, that drive to be in the spotlight, it never really went away.
So after military school, it's off to college. First Fordham, then the Wharton School of Business at UPenn. Pretty prestigious stuff, but there are those rumors about someone else taking the SATs for him.
Yeah. The sources don't confirm that directly, but there's this testimony from a Wharton admissions officer who knew the family. And he said he wasn't struck by any sense that I'm sitting before a genius. Pretty interesting statement.
Then comes the Vietnam War. While other guys his age are getting drafted, Donald receives 5 deferments. 4 for education and 1, well, famously, for bone spurs.
There's a lot of controversy surrounding those medical deferments, especially because, the doctors involved had ties to Fred Trump. But the bottom line is that Donald avoided military service completely.
Instead, he ends up joining his dad's business, working on those middle-income housing projects in Queens. But then things take a turn in 1973 when the Department of Justice files a lawsuit alleging racial discrimination in their rental practices. This feels like a pretty important moment, right?
It really does. This lawsuit, even early on, I think shows us something really important about how Trump operates. He's faced with, pretty strong evidence, and he chooses to fight it with everything he's got. He even countersues the DOJ for, get this, $100 million. Most people would just try to settle, but not Trump.
And here's where we start to see that pattern emerge. Never admit you're wrong. It took 2 years, but they eventually settled with Trump agreeing to make some changes. But he never, ever admitted to doing anything wrong.
Exactly. And that aversion to admitting any fault, that need to project an image of being successful all the time, well, it becomes a theme throughout his whole career.
You get the feeling that whole experience with the lawsuit maybe kind of soured Donald on his father's way of doing business. He sets his sights on Manhattan, the world of luxury high-rises and powerful people. Queens just wasn't big enough for him anymore.
He wanted to be a major player, and Manhattan in the 70s was the place to be, that's for sure. It was gritty, full of potential, but also a lot of risk.
But Trump saw that potential, and he wasn't afraid to use his family connections and, let's say, take advantage of every tax break he could find to get what he wanted. And then, of course, there's Trump Tower.
Trump Tower. More than just a building, I mean, Trump Tower on Fifth Avenue, that was a statement. That pink marble, the gold accents.
Yeah.
It just screamed Trump.
And it was with Trump Tower that he really started to master, well, manipulating the media. Remember the New York tabloids? He was practically a fixture on page 6, playing up every deal, every fight, every little over-the-top detail.
He just understood that it wasn't just about buildings. It was about building a persona, this larger-than-life image that people would be drawn to.
But behind all the glitz and the headlines, the sources suggest that his business skills weren't always as sharp as he made them out to be. There were shady deals, accusations of tax evasion, even hints of, well, outright fraud.
Yeah, he was really good at using other people's money, often taking on huge amounts of debt to finance his projects. And when things went bad, He always found a way to blame someone else and minimize his own losses.
Like the Commodore Hotel deal. He grabs it, renovates it, turns it into the Grand Hyatt, and makes it sound like a massive win.
Oh, totally. But when you look closely, you see all these backroom deals, these tax breaks that were, well, let's just say questionable, and financial practices that even back then raised some red flags.
So it was all about winning, even if winning meant convincing everyone he was winning, no matter what the reality was.
Exactly. Maximize gains, deflect responsibility, classic Trump.
And as he got more and more famous, he started putting his name on everything. Steaks, vodka, a board game, even an airline. He was building a brand, an empire, or at least it looked that way.
And that airline, well, that went bankrupt pretty fast.
It did, yeah.
But that almost doesn't seem to matter.
Yeah.
He was licensing his name, creating this image of success, but not always taking the full risk himself. It was pretty clever, actually, but also a little cynical, wouldn't you say?
It seems like everything he did was about control, about shaping the narrative no matter what. But then the 1990s hit, and things took a bit of a, well, a downturn, right?
Yeah, the 90s were a roller coaster for a lot of folks. But for Trump, it was almost like a Shakespearean tragedy. All that debt he'd racked up, some risky investments, and the economy shifting, it all kind of caught up with him.
Yeah, he lost billions. His casinos in Atlantic City went bankrupt, and on top of that, his personal life implodes with a very public, very messy divorce from Ivana.
Oh, man, the tabloids had a field day with that. The affair with Marla Maples, accusations of, well, marital rape, the fight over assets. It was all over the headlines. And remember that huge West Side Rail Yards project he was pushing for? That fell apart, too.
It's amazing, though, how even with all these setbacks, he still spun things to make himself look good. He claimed he made a smart business move, selling off the development rights for the rail yards, but the reality was he was in deep financial trouble. He even had to sell his yacht, the Trump Princess. Can you imagine?
It's kind of funny, right? This larger-than-life guy having to downsize. But even then, he never let the facade drop. He just, pivots, adapts, and keeps projecting this image of being in control no matter what. It's a real key part of his persona.
And that's where his talent for reinvention comes in. He needed a comeback story, and he definitely delivered. He writes, "The art of the comeback," starts doing even more media appearances, and slaps his name on anything he can license. The Trump brand was back.
Oh, yeah, big time. And this time, it wasn't just about buildings or businesses. It was his whole persona, this image of the ultimate comeback kid, the guy who could bounce back from anything.
But behind the scenes, there were already rumors of something bigger, right? Political ambitions.
Yeah, there were hints of it back then in the late 90s. But it was the rise of that Reform Party, the one led by Ross Perot, that really got his attention. Perot, another wealthy businessman, had really shaken up the political scene. He showed that there was a real desire for an outsider candidate.
He even talked about Oprah Winfrey being his running mate. Can you imagine? That would have been something.
It was a brilliant, if short-lived, look into how he thought about politics. He was testing the waters, seeing how people would react. In the end, he dropped out, blaming all the infighting in the Reform Party. But you get the feeling he learned a lot from that whole experience.
Yeah, he realized that to win, he'd need a united party behind him, a message that tapped into people's frustrations, and a platform that really resonated with them on a gut level.
Exactly. And that platform started taking shape in the early 2000s. Think about what was happening then. 9/11, the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, the 2008 financial crisis. It all created this atmosphere of fear, anger, and economic uncertainty. And Trump would eventually become a master at playing on those emotions.
And then there's The Apprentice. It was more than just a reality show. It was a total image makeover. Gone was the flashy, debt-ridden developer. He was now this decisive, successful businessman, the ultimate boss.
Millions of people tuned in every week to see him fire people with that "you're fired" line. It was great TV, and it completely revived his image. He was back in the spotlight, controlling the story and solidifying this idea of him as a strong, no-nonsense leader.
And this time, he wasn't just reaching New Yorkers or business people. It was middle America, the same people he'd need to win over in a presidential election. He was laying the groundwork, wasn't he?
Absolutely. He was presenting himself as the guy who could fix everything that was wrong with America. And there's this interesting character lurking in the background, Steve Bannon, a far-right political strategist who saw Trump as the perfect vehicle for his nationalist ideas.
Bannon, who'd go on to be Trump's chief strategist, he was great at manipulating the media, too. He knew how to tap into people's anxieties, their fears, their resentments. He saw Trump as this ultimate disruptor, the guy who could harness the anger of the Tea Party movement and turn it into a winning coalition.
Right. And it was during the 2012 election when Trump became the face of the birther movement, questioning where Barack Obama was born. That's when he seemed to really grasp the power of outrage and conspiracy theories.
It was a cynical move, no doubt, but it worked. It energized a certain group of people who felt ignored, disrespected by the political establishment. It showed that he wasn't afraid to play dirty, to exploit racial tensions, to undermine democratic norms, tactics that would become his trademark.
He didn't run in 2012, but he was watching, learning, waiting for his chance. And that chance came in 2015. The political landscape was perfect for someone like Trump. A deeply divided country, a Republican Party struggling to figure out who they were, and this growing feeling that the American dream was slipping away.
And then, on that day in June 2015, down the escalator he goes, announcing his candidacy in a speech that would set the tone for his whole campaign.
It was a performance, a masterful mix of populism, nationalism, and, well, some thinly veiled xenophobia. He railed against immigrants, promised to make America great again, and tapped into that deep well of resentment towards the political elite. He was a showman, a provocateur, and he knew exactly what to say to get a reaction.
Right from the start, he seemed to enjoy pushing the limits of what was acceptable to say. He called Mexican immigrants rapists, suggested banning Muslims from entering the country, and promised to build a wall on the border with Mexico, a literal and figurative symbol of his America First ideology.
And it worked. His campaign was a spectacle, a reality show on a national scale. He dominated the news, bullied his opponents, and used social media like a weapon, going around traditional media and speaking directly to his supporters.
The Republican establishment was horrified, but they completely underestimated how much people liked him. He won primary after primary, leaving all these confused, defeated opponents behind. It was like watching a political earthquake happen.
He understood how to use people's grievances, how to turn anger and resentment into votes. His rallies were electric, full of supporters who saw him as their savior, the one who would finally drain the swamp in Washington.
And then there's his opponent, Hillary Clinton. A flawed candidate, sure, but one with tons of experience. The sources suggest that her campaign, while well run, just didn't have the same kind of emotional energy that Trump had.
Yeah, and then there were the emails, the WikiLeaks stuff, the FBI investigations. It was this constant stream of bad headlines that, even if they didn't have much substance, made people think Clinton was untrustworthy and out of touch.
And Trump played that game perfectly. He was a master of distraction, always deflecting, always controlling the narrative. He dominated the news with his Twitter rants, keeping everyone off balance.
And he was helped by a media landscape that was becoming more and more fragmented and partisan. The rise of cable news and social media created these echo chambers where his supporters could just reinforce their beliefs and dismiss any criticism as fake news.
And then there's that Access Hollywood tape, the one where he bragged about grabbing women by the pussy. It was a huge scandal, the kind of thing that should have ended his campaign.
You'd think so, right?
Right.
But instead, he apologizes, blames Bill Clinton's past behavior, and somehow turns it into an attack on political correctness. It was a pretty amazing display of audacity, and for his supporters, it just made them like him more.
Yeah, they saw it as proof that he was a real man, someone who didn't care about being polite. He was the outsider, the rebel, the one who'd fight for them no matter what.
And then, on election night, against all the odds, he wins. It was a victory that shocked the world, showed just how divided America was, and kicked off a period of incredible political turmoil.
So here we are, at the end of this wild ride through the life and career of Donald Trump. It's been, well, quite a journey, hasn't it? From real estate to reality TV to the Oval Office. He always seems to find a way to keep people talking.
He's definitely one of the, I'd say, one of the most fascinating people in American history. He's a master of self-promotion, a real showman who gets the power of spectacle and emotion, and a polarizing figure who's definitely changed the political landscape.
Looking back at all this, what do you think is the most defining thing about Donald Trump?
That's a tough one. But I guess if I had to pick one thing, I'd say it's his total belief in himself, his unshakable confidence, even when things go wrong or people criticize him. It's almost like he's got like a Teflon coating. Nothing sticks. He's been accused of just about everything. He's made mistakes. He's almost gone broke. And yet he always seems to bounce back.
Yeah, it's like he plays by a different set of rules. He bends the truth, attacks anyone who disagrees with him, says stuff that would destroy any other politician. And yet his supporters, they love him for it. They see him as authentic, someone who isn't afraid to say what he thinks, even if it's, well, offensive or over the top.
He's tapped into something really powerful, something that goes beyond, typical political stuff. It's this feeling of frustration, this sense that the system is rigged against them. And he's made himself out to be the only one who can fix it, the one who'll fight for the little guy.
It's strange, isn't it? I mean, he comes from privilege. He's a billionaire who lives in this, gold-covered tower. But he's somehow convinced working-class Americans that he's one of them, that he understands their problems.
And to be fair, some of his policies did appeal to his base.
Mm,
The tax cuts, the deregulation, all the tough talk on trade and immigration, those were all things that resonated with a certain group of people.
right. But then there's the other side of that, isn't there? All the divisive stuff he said, the attacks on democracy itself, getting close to dictators, the constant lying and misinformation. It's hard to deny that his presidency did a lot of damage.
There's no doubt about that. He made people distrust the media, he stirred up racial tensions, he weakened America's position in the world, and he left the country deeply divided.
So where does that leave us? What's the legacy of Donald Trump?
Hmm. Another tough question. I think historians will be arguing about that for a long time. He's a complicated guy, full of contradictions. He's achieved amazing things. He's failed spectacularly. He's been admired and hated.
Well, this deep dive has given us a lot to think about, that's for sure. Donald Trump
Yeah.
is, he's a force of nature, someone who's left a real mark on America. But it's up to each of us to decide what that mark means and what we can learn from how he got to be so powerful.
Yeah, as you sort through all this, think about the things that shaped his life, the people who helped him along the way, and the trends in society that made his presidency possible.
Mhm.
What does his story tell us about American democracy? And what does it mean for the future of our country? Those are questions worth thinking about, don't you think?